All right. So this text is from the canon, from the literary canon, which you would call Afrofuturism. Um, the author of the text, Octavia Butler, is like the godmother of Afrofuturism. Very, very brilliant scholar. Uh, she is also what we think of as like a prophetess because she's able to kind of project what the future may look and feel like. For those that are in like the Pasadena area, the Huntington Library has her papers in their library. So if you have some time, it may be something worth checking out if you really enjoyed the novel. Some of her other texts that are really popular is the text Kindred. There's a series called the Parable series. That's probably one of my favorite works by her. For that particular series, the setting is 2024 until 2035. And you really get a sense of why people look at her as a prophetess because, again, so we're in 2021, so this is like 3 years in our future. And the way that she captures our near future is so spot on. In fact, the antagonist of the story is a presidential candidate who becomes the president in the second series. I'm sorry, in the second book of the series. And his slogan is "Make America Great Again." Right. So again, just the ability for her to project our future is pretty uncanny. Now, those stories were written in the late 1980s and then the mid 1990s. So again, to be able to even pinpoint something as specific as "Make America Great Again," almost 30 years in advance, is pretty remarkable. So this particular story comes from a book of short stories. The book is called Child Blood, or Blood Child, excuse me. Um, and we'll get into it. So the book is called The Book of Martha, or the story is called The Book of Martha. One of the most things that leaped out to me is the writing. She's a phenomenal writer, and then she also kind of for this text in particular, you're dropped into a moment, right? You're dropped into Martha's contemporary moment without any context, and you're just kind of almost as confused as Martha is, right? Um, yeah, Jermaine. Like I spent my whole last summer just reading Octavia Butler. So I mean, if you guys have free time and you want to get into some good stories, she's definitely a great place to start. But when I think about like her brilliant writing, the so like the third paragraph of the text, I know the numbers of the pages may be a little off because you guys got the PDF, but it says God kept silent, but was so palpably, disturbingly present that even in the silence, Martha felt rebuked. And to me, that's just a beautiful constructed sentence, and it kind of situates you to what we'll be dealing with as we go forward, right? Um, and then I was also struck by the human characteristics of God, right? God seemed very human, right? It talks about how God got bored with knowing how things would kind of unfold all the time, so they stopped reading people's minds and what have you. I also found when she asked the question on page 191, right? Why do you look like this a twice-sized bearded white man when referring to God? And God's response to me was very profound, and it sets up not only the rest of the story, but to me, it's an interesting meditation on how we as individuals perceive the world. And God's response was, "You see what your life has prepared you to see." And to me, if we really think about that, right, and start to kind of apply that to other aspects of our world and our understanding of the world, that becomes very fecund. Um, and then God gives her, when He gives her her task, right? God says, keep in mind Jonah, Job, and Noah. And for those who have a biblical background, you understand the stories of Jonah, Noah, and Job. For those who don't, the story goes into it, but just know that Jonah was supposed to do something for God. Jonah refused to. God caused his ship to get shipwrecked, get swallowed by a whale, and the whale took him to where he was supposed to be, right? Job got caught up in a wager between God and the devil. The devil bet God that if you take away all of Job's riches, he will curse you, right? And so they went through the process of taking all of Job's riches, his family, his home, etc. And Job still did not curse God, right? And Noah, he was told to build the ark to reinstate mankind and humankind once God flood the earth, right? So those are the stories of Noah, Job, and Jonah. And God says, keep these stories in mind. And to me, this is a warning saying that you cannot get away from the task that I've set before you. And so the task that God has set before her, let me see, let's read this. This is what you're to do, God said. You will help humankind to survive its greedy, murderous, wasteful adolescence. Help it to find less destructive, more peaceful, sustainable ways to live. Right. So that's the task that God places before Martha. And then he tells her, once you finish this task, you're going to go back to earth and live amongst these people, but you have to live as the lowliest of the lowlies, right? As the wretched of the earth, as Frantz Fanon may say. And I found Martha's response to that task that God provided her, in the sense of having to live as the lowliest of the lowlies, to be very profound as well, because she says, you know my story, right? I'm a black woman. I was born to a single mother who was 14 when she had me. I experienced homelessness, right? So I am the lowliest of the lows, right? And I'm not going back to do that. And then she asks, well, is that why you chose me? Right? And that's something to think about also, especially when you think about the construction of systems that are they're not inclusive, right? So when you think about you can use the internet and that form of technology, right? It's constructed in a way that it is perceived to be a universally applied system of engagement, right? Like everyone has access to the internet. But if you start to think about it, really, that's not the case, right? And this COVID moment showed us the disparities in who has access to the internet. And what happens is when people from privileged backgrounds create things, they can't account for aspects of their privilege that don't allow other elements of society to be incorporated, right? And this is, I think, what's at play here with Martha saying, "Is this why you asked me to do the task?" Um, and then within that dialogue, within that exchange, God tells Martha, let me find it. It's page 202 on my text. Um, Yeah. So God tells Martha, you're an author, you're a storyteller, you write characters and you write scenarios that are more demanding than what I'm asking you to do here, right? So one thing about Octavia Butler, she always writes herself into her stories, right? So what is Martha's occupation? She's an author, right? And we find towards the end of the story that her home is in Seattle, Washington. Now, Octavia Butler is from Pasadena, California, but in her later stages of her life, she moves to Seattle, Washington, and she actually has a house overlooking this very same lake that Martha is overlooking, right? So you see her writing herself into her stories. Um, in Kindred is another book that I named. The protagonist is an author. In the Parable series, the protagonist becomes an author later on in the story. But think about how not only Octavia Butler, but God within the story is kind of situating the power of the writer, right? And what God is telling Martha, what you do as your profession is really is more demanding than what I'm asking you to do here, right? Like you do that at a much higher frequency when you're producing your novels than what I'm this little small change that I'm asking you to make in this moment. And Martha's saying that's not necessarily the case because my characters that I write on paper, they don't feel the pain of my story, right? They're not living, breathing entities. To whereas the change that you are asking me to make is going to impact people's really everyday quotidian lives. Okay. Um. Okay. And then we're kind of situated with what Martha, the change that Martha decides to make, and giving people these very vivid and lively dreams. And that's the way of her making people, making mankind or humankind better. Um, and then there's also this interesting point to me, and it's a little bit abstract, but to me, I found it very interesting. On page 206, God, sorry, excuse me, Martha asked to be by herself, and then God lets her have her isolation, but He tells her, speak out loud to me when you want to talk, and I'll come. And I think for me at least, this is a symbolism of really how to engage God, period. Right? Like I think having these conversations and these dialogues with whatever entity that you so choose or to identify as God is the way to engage in an exchange with God, right? Like you speak to him or speak to her, um, as you would anyone else, right? Even from an African spiritual context, you kind of encourage to speak to your ancestors and engage them and ask them for guidance, and they will provide that guidance to you, right? But you must treat them as if they're not, as we understand, to be dead, right? And I think that's kind of at play with the exchanges between Martha and God. So those are the notes that I have for the reading. We'll jump into our fishbowl. I did compile who has went for their fishbowl, who has went twice, who has went once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the names of those who I have on paper who have already done their two fishbowls. If you don't hear your name and you think that you've done the two, please let me know. So this first list are for the people who are done. The next list that I'll read um, will be the people who have went one time. Okay, so Jasmine Jung, you're finished. Fatima, you're finished. Nicole, Liliana, Alexis, Kimberly. I read Jasmine. Kim, Nicole, Alexis. Those are the people who are done. Again, if you think that your name has not been called and it should be, let me know. Um, and for the people who have went, you've done too. Okay, I got you, Jeremy. Anybody else? Kenneth, I thought I got you too, Kenneth. Yeah, I
I
did.
did too.
You did. I got you, bro.
Did
I
you
did.
hear me?
Alexander, you got two
But
also. Okay. George, George. All right. Fatima. Yeah, I got you, Fatima. You have two. Um, okay, I'm gonna let me. You should be done, Joanne. Okay, I got you, Joanne. All right. Let me read the revised. Um, Let me read the revised list based on what you guys just told me. So Jasmine, Fatima, Nicole, Liliana, Alexander, Alexis, Kimberly, Jasmine, Joanne, Kim, Kenneth, Nicole, Alexis, George, and Jermaine. That's what I have based off of the updated list.
I've done two, Professor.
Okay.
I've also done two.
And Jen.
It's Jana.
Gotcha. All right, so I added those two to the list. So let me do this. I'm going to read the people who have won, and if you hear your name with this one, you probably want to volunteer for the fishbowl today because it's our last fishbowl. Angelica, Javier, Jack, Trisha, Natalia, um, and Douglas. So those are the only people who, and Esmeralda, you have one. So those are the people I have who have went one time. So
I have one as well.
Valeria. Yes, I'm sorry, Valeria. I do have you down. I didn't say your name. I'm sorry. But yes, you as well. So again, for the people who have one fishbowl, Angelica, Javier, Jack, Trisha, Natalia, um, Jennifer, Esmeralda, Valeria, and Douglas. So I know Esmeralda says she would like the fishbowl. Anybody else want to volunteer? And again, this is the last.
Hello.
Valeria, okay. It's your last opportunity to fishbowl. Yeah, I think that's it because Douglas is not here today. Also, I mentioned in the email, but there's an extra credit opportunity for Monday at 4 p.m. I'll be doing another conversation at Antioch University, this time on Pan Africanism. In the email has the link, and it's also posted on your Google Classroom site. So that's another opportunity to get some extra credit. Outside of that, I'll shut up. Esmeralda, Valeria, it's on you guys for our last fishbowl of the semester.
I'll go first. So I'm gonna go off what I wrote for my notes, if that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk about a quote that Martha said, or well, God said, you see what your life has prepared you to see. And I think that kind of goes with question number one. And I thought it was interesting because it implies that we've practically been like conditioned to see God as a white man. And it takes her like to the very end of the story to see God as herself, which was a Black woman. And then I also wanted to talk about the topic of free will. I thought it was like kind of contradicting because God basically says like, oh, like you can use any power, like to better humanity and stuff like that. And then, but she kind of had no choice because God was like, oh, like I can give this power to anybody, and what if then Martha thought like, oh, that can land into like the hands of the wrong person, like a racist or someone. And I think like she even asked God like, oh, like what if I refuse this power, and he was like, oh, you won't. So yeah, that's what I got from that.
Thank you, Esmeralda.
I totally agree with that. I was gonna answer the second question. Why do you think the change Martha chose? So I think she chose dreams to change like the way we think. Because this one quote specifically says nothing slows people down like satisfaction, and so like satisfaction you can obtain it through dreams if it's a good dream, so to say. So I think that's why satisfaction plays a big role in dreams. And like, yeah, I think it also, let me see. Oh, like, okay, so satisfaction changes over time. And then there was another quote where it says, that's the trouble with habits, they tend to outlive their usefulness. So I think the ability for dreams to change and evolve is the reason why she chose that specific change, because they can continue to be useful and satisfactory.
Okay, thank you guys. Great fishbowl. Well, I wanted to something that Valeria said that really struck me also. As she kind of stays in that space longer, right, and God changes and changes and changes. Um, God takes on her image, right, and she says like, "Yo, we could be sisters." And then when she hugs God, right, it mentions that God has on the same jeans and T-shirts that would be found in Martha's closet, right. And Valeria hits it on the head, saying God takes on Martha's image, right? And I think this is a very interesting meditation on how we interact with how we view deities such as gods, right? And I can think about my personal experience growing up in a Christian home, going to churches where they have a specified image of God. You're socialized and you're conditioned to view God in this certain framework. And for Martha, right, it was her school textbooks that gave her the image of Michelangelo's depiction of God. But personally, as I got through the journey or through the progression of consciousness, coming enlightened or coming aware or exposed to versions of truth. Um, the greatest struggle for me was letting go of Christianity, and letting and the fear that Christianity instills in going to hell, right? Like, because again, I'm growing up in a Christian home. You're always being socialized to understand you do X, Y, Z, you could go to hell. Um, but as I got further and further down the rabbit hole of consciousness, that fear begins to erode, right? And then when I really let go of Christianity completely, The struggle became when I would close my eyes to do my meditation, or I would close my eyes to do my spiritual work. I couldn't shake that image that I was socialized through the church to perceive, right? And even though I would verbally say, God is a black woman, that's what God would look like. I would say that, and I believe that. When I would close my eyes to do my spiritual work, I couldn't shake that image, right? And that was like the last um, vestige of Christianity that I was really struggling to do away with. And when I was able to, it was a liberating factor. But I bring this up to say, right, how once you, and it plays out with Martha as well, once she kind of comes over her fear, she's able to change the way that God is viewed, right? And within that change, God is viewed as she is viewed. She sees it as herself, right? So I wonder if you guys picked up on the fear kind of keeping Martha to see God in one way, right? And she even asked the question, why do you look like this? Because even for Martha, that was a disconnect, right? Because she wouldn't question the way that God looked if she was not uncomfortable with the way that God looks, right? So the fear does a great job of contracting these images that we've received through system of oppression, and it does not allow us to overcome those images. So I wonder if anyone else picked up on the role that fear played within the story. Um, so what about question 3 in the breakout rooms? Why do you guys think that I assigned this text, and did you find it beneficial for the cultivation of your final projects?
I think I found it useful because it kind of like we can use the I in our within our project, I guess, and like kind of embed our story within it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who else? Why else do you think I chose you to read this, or did you find this to be beneficial for the development of your project?
I think it makes you like think how solving or changing something is always going to have consequences.
Absolutely. That's exactly why I chose this, Galleria. And if you think about what your project is tasked to do, right, and kind of step away from the project for a moment and think about the subject matter that you're dealing with, the Constitution, and think about who created the Constitution, right? Um, and it goes back to Martha saying, "Oh, is this why you chose me?" Right? Because of the privilege of those who cultivated the Constitution, they were able to leave people out of that Constitution, right? But allowing for the lowliness of the lows to have a seat at the table in the development of the Constitution would have allowed for a more humanistic and comprehensive and inclusive cultivation of the Constitution, right? Also, because of their privilege, they have the ability not to think about the consequences of how they're trying to shape society, right? But for us in this course, we've dealt with the issues that our society is been facing for a very long time, right? So we're attentive to that. And now we should be able to make a change with understanding how these consequences may play out and make a change keeping in mind those who've been left out of the Constitution originally, right? So yes, you're absolutely right. I want us to be very meticulous and very reflective in the change that we seek to make, and think about how anybody and everyone can be affected by that change. Absolutely. Another thing is too, right? Like, and this kind of goes under this umbrella that's Afrofuturism. Oftentimes, especially for marginalized communities, for oppressed communities, we are so focused on dismantling the system of oppression, right? And what happens is your focus is so embedded on dismantling the system of oppression, you don't pay much attention to what are we going to build in its place. So once capitalism is destroyed, what's going to be the economic system that will supplement capitalism, right? Once racism is destroyed, what will be the ism that kind of moves and shapes society, right? And to me, the project of Afrofuturism is to imagine what the future will be, right? And a fundamental component of Afrofuturism is taking into account all that's going on wrong in your world to build your future, right? So being attentive to that we live in a sexist society. So how are you going to create a future that's non-sexist? Being attentive to the fact that we live in an anti-black society. So how are you going to create a society that's non-anti-black, right? So taking what's going on in your present as a condition to not build your future, right? And to me, this becomes important because you cannot do revolutionary work, you cannot do abolitionist work without not knowing what you're building in its place, right? So I agree wholeheartedly, right? Defund the police. I agree wholeheartedly that the police is a system that cannot be reformed. It has to be done away with. But you better know what you're going to put in its place to supplement it. Because what also could happen, you run the risk of replacing a bad system with a worse system, right? Or replacing a bad system, a racist system, with a system that does the same thing but just puts another race in its place, right? For those who are familiar with this idea of neocolonialism, that's what neocolonialism is, right? You get rid of colonialism and you put a person in power who looks like the people, but the resources still do not go to the people. Those people still remain oppressed, right? So a fundamental project of doing revolutionary and abolitionist work is to know what you're building. It's not about what you're destroying. It's more so about what you're building. Other thoughts? What are you guys' thoughts on the reading? Did you like it? What did you feel about it? What did you feel about her writing? What did you feel about her method? Just thoughts about the reading. Y'all sleep? I know it's the last class. We got 20 minutes, right? That's all we got for me for the rest of the semester. Other than that, we're doing our project. So let's just engage in dialogue for the last 20 minutes and call it a day. So what were your thoughts on the reading?
I found it pretty interesting that everyone has their own depiction of God one way or another. Because I'm a Catholic myself. I have repeated that like 3 times in the class. I'm so sorry if it gets annoying. But like, I like to imagine God as like this big yellow sun thing that can take on different forms depending on what you choose to see him as. He'll either appear as a ball of light, he'll appear as a woman, he'll appear as a person that has no gender. You can see him as anything. And I think that idea is actually super comforting and inclusive, so no one feels left out of it, you know?
You know, you bring up a good point, Janet. So like historically, right? If you look at a lot of what we'll call indigenous cultures, so like cultures indigenous to the America, African indigenous cultures. I don't know about like Buddhism and things of that nature. I'm really not sure. I don't have the knowledge to say. But I know specifically also for African culture, right? There was never an image of God in a human form, right? If you think about the Kemetic culture, God would be depicted as Ra, which is the sun, right? Because that is the supreme energy on the planet, right? Or God would take on the form of deities, or there'll be multiple versions of God, right? But there was never a human characteristic or a human interpretation of what God would look like. That didn't really come to power or come to fore until the birth of modernity, until the Council of Nicaea, until the Crusades kind of came into place, and where Europe and the Catholic Church says we're going to take this image of God and spread it throughout the world, right, and use this as a mechanism to conquer really and to imperialize the world. And once that kind of kicked in, then you started to see these very specified depictions of God, right? So even the image of God coincides with global domination by European institutions. So I think you bring up a really good point, Jana, in the sense of not viewing God or having a version of God that shifts, moves, and is adaptable. Because you know the way I understand it, right? God is an energy. God is a force. God is all, right? And if that is the case, that being can't be limited to just being a man, just being a white man, right? Just being a woman or anything. It encompasses all of these things. Good point. Who else?
I thought that the form of the dreams was really interesting, and how she said the only type of utopia uh, a culture or a society can have is only through their dreams instead of reality.
On the version that you guys had, that I sent out the PDF, do you guys have the afterword?
Yeah, there was the afterword.
Yeah, and I think the afterword is really dope because she says like, this is my utopia story, because I really don't believe in utopias. So that's Octavia Butler writing, right? But she, even for Martha, right? She says the only ways that we can have an effective utopia is that everyone has their own personal utopia, right? So I agree with you, Jeremy. Like that's a really good point, and it's true, right? Because even if you think about it, if you really like think about this closely, the only ways that utopias get established is through conquering and dominations, right? Because different societies have different value systems, right? And the utopia is kind of like everybody can kind of get along and everybody things of that nature, which is true. But up until now, right, we haven't seen any evidence of difference at play in societies and it being harmony, right? Those differences are typically taken and used to create wars, create dissension, and create divisiveness, right? So I think it was very astute of Martha and Octavia Butler to say, well, if we're going to have these utopias, they need to be individual utopias. And I think that also speaks to the ability of there can be difference, but it doesn't mean that it has to be a violent difference or a difference that marginalizes one group over the other, right? Like difference in with of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's what people do with difference is what makes it a bad thing. Other thoughts? Did anybody think about their final project while reading the book?
Well, I thought of this one quote. It says, "Of course, you can't put an end to all of those things without putting an end to humanity, but you can diminish some of the problems." So pretty much, when I read that, I was like, okay, so in our amendment, we can't like absolutely get rid of the whole problem. It's like there's multiple parts that go into play.
Yeah. And according to Butler, right, or God and Martha, based on their conversation, the only way to get rid of all the problems is just to get rid of humanity. And that also gets teased out because, she asked them, have you tried that before? Yeah. Have you tried, it was the Tower of Babel a real thing? Like, yeah, like God, I've tried several ways to kind of eradicate this or even having to just start over, right? Think about the story of Noah. He flooded the earth because people wasn't getting listening to his instructions, right? Um, Random, but on another note, thinking about the stories of Noah, Jonah, and Job, especially Job. Like to me, I don't know if that's a God I want to fuck with, right? Like, so if I could be subjected to all of that shit just because you and the devil have a bet, right? So mind you, in the story of Job, Job did nothing wrong. All of his calamity came from a wager that was taking place between God and the devil, right? And to me, I don't know if I could get to that, because if you know the story of Job, he went through a lot, right? Like he went through a whole lot, and it seems kind of trivial for someone to have to go through that just because of a wager placed, right? And I don't know. To me, that's not a very good depiction of a loving, caring type of God, right? That's a to me that's very a petty God. That's a trivial God. Just to me, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how comfortable I would feel with that. Other thoughts about the reading or about anything we've covered so far?
I think that the reading kind of showed how uh the world is like a gamble.
Mm. Explain
Cause
what you.
like,
Go ahead.
cause cause Martha was questioning God, like if he did this and did that, like he tried all these things,
Mm-hmm.
and like in doing that, it's like a gamble of like what's gonna come out and what's the end product of everything.
Yeah, I got you. Like an experiment, also, right? Like it's an
Yeah.
experimentation, just kind of trying different things out. Yeah, that's a really good point. Um, yeah, and to think, right, like God is experimenting, like someone who is understood to be all seeing and knowing. You wouldn't think that he or she would have to experiment; that they would know what would need to be done to kind of correct the changes, right? But yeah, I agree with you, Esmeralda. I think that's a really good point, right? Like you're just trying things out to see what works and see how ways that we could improve. And if there is no measure of improvement, then we'll just start over. And there's, if you read the Bible, there's a couple of examples of that restart button being pushed, right? Um, what do you guys think about? Hold on. There's a way that they describe the world, right? He says the humankind will survive its greedy, murderous, wasteful adolescence. So a couple of things that play there, right? So one, he's saying humankind is murderous, wasteful, um, and then he says like it's in an adolescent stage. What is the adolescence? What does it mean to be an adolescence? You've all went through adolescence already, so what is that?
To be like a naive teenager who thinks they know everything, but they really don't.
Right. And so take that definition and apply it to humankind. Do you think it fits? Do you think it's accurate? What do you think? Do you think we're yeah, Kimberly says yeah. Who feels that is an inaccurate description of humankind or mankind? Okay, so we all agree that it's accurate. So Kimberly, why do you feel it's an accurate description?
Just because I guess everyone thinks they like in the first, yeah, we're gonna be a little naive, but then eventually we're like, oh yeah, we got the hang of this. We know what's going on. We have like this sometimes this timeline, I guess, so we kind of expect it. So that's kind of like a naiveness in the sense that that's gonna happen in this time. Like, oh, you're gonna get a house at 30 or like 40,
Yeah.
but things don't go as planned. Everything is just kind of coming at you like out of nowhere in a sense. So I guess that's kind of like the sort of naiveness that comes from us.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Kimberly. What do you guys think about the wastefulness she describes in this humankind? How do you understand or situate the wastefulness? And for me, I'm thinking about like planetary concerns. I'm thinking about scarcity of water in the future. I'm thinking about ozone layer depletion and things like that. And to me, this is where I'm kind of getting this wastefulness. And if I tie that these versions of wastefulness with the adolescence, right, is this implicit idea or this implicit notion that hyper capitalism will just continue on as it is, right, and will usurp everything, um, And worst case scenario, we'll just like transition into Mars or go live on another planet, right? Instead of making changes to societal behaviors that will allow us to sustain this planet, right? We're capitalistic forces are willing to burn this planet under the guise that we can just go to another one, right? And to me, that's part of the wastefulness, a very large scale vision of this wastefulness that Octavia Butler and Martha are grappling with, right? And it speaks back to the adolescence. I don't know. I guess maybe some of you guys are out of your parents' houses now, but for those who are, think about the difference, right? Um, Running the water when you're living at your parents' house, right? But then having to live on your own and pay your own water bill, right? You're gonna look at wastefulness a little bit differently. Buying things like lotions and stuff like that that you need that your parents always bought for you, but then being out on your own and having to buy it yourself, you're gonna be a little bit more attentive to how you use those products, right? So that's ties to this idea of this adolescence and this wastefulness, right? It's she's saying that we're in humankind is in this like childlike state, but they think that they're adults, right? And I think that's a profound articulation of the human state, right? We think we could answer all of our issues. We think we could solve all of our problems, but in fact, we can't because we haven't been able to, right? Or we're not doing the work necessary or taking the time to be self-reflective as a society to allow us to do the work to begin to change these things at play, right? So a part of this process to be able to make these changes is one, doing away with fear, right? It's a responsibility to someone beyond yourself, right? And then it's the ability to see beyond your circumstances. And the reason I say that it goes back to Martha's question of, is that why you picked me, right? Because she comes from the lowliest of the lows. So because of her circumstances, she's going to be attentive to what it feels like to be homeless because she was homeless before, right? She's going to be attentive to young single parenthood and the trials and tribulations of that because she experienced that as a child dealing with her mother's issues, right? So I say being able to look beyond your circumstances, and what I mean by that is, even though I haven't experienced what it's like to be a single mother, right? I can't experience that, but I can think about those individuals when I seek to make changes, right? So being able to see beyond my personal circumstances, right? I don't know what it's like to be a woman walking down the street late at night, right? I don't know what fear could be produced from that, but I could think about those people in those circumstances and think about creating a world that does not present that fear for them, right? So I think this book is a lot, this short story offers a lot on how to envision new versions of society and new versions of change. Because really, at the end of the day, I don't think anyone would agree with the state of the world as it is now, right? And so if you don't agree with it, the task then becomes, what are you going to do about it and how are you going to go about making that change? And I think Afrofuturism, I think Octavia Butler's work, it offers a lot of pathways and tools that allow us to do that on a very effective capacity. We'll end class there. Are there any questions you guys have about your final projects or your presentations or anything? All right. I'm looking forward to it. We'll see you guys next week. There is no readings or anything. Just kind of focus on making sure those projects are tight. Enjoy it. Try not to stress off of them too much. I think you guys will be fine. And I will see you all next Thursday. Peace.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.